Okay, so we are moving on with our discussion of public policy. We are moving now to chapter two of the textbook. This chapter basically deals with how the constitutional framework basically enables or facilitates the policy process. So again, the objectives of this chapter describe the effect of federalism on national and state policy making, summarize the evolution of federal and state policymaking power, identify primary actors in the policymaking process. And like last class, I'll also be bringing in some additional readings as well to provide more context. So, origins of public policy. Now, here they go way back. Public policy origins trace to ancient civilizations, the Sumerian monarchs in the fourth millennium BCE. Historically, authoritarian governments made policy with little public input. They talk about the Magna Carta in 1215 began limiting monarchs' power. Very broad, historical context here. Obviously, the Age of Revolution, the late 18th century, established that government power should derive from the consent of the government, which of course is contained in the Declaration of Independence as well. Constitutions now identify and restrain policymaking powers while dictating access for non-government actors. They go on to talk about the Articles of Confederation, basically the first Constitution of the United States. Little known, little talked about now, but introduced in 1776, ratified in 1781, created a confederate government, power derived from sovereign state government. So it did not have the stronger federal government that we all know and love, of course. Designed to avoid strong central government, fear of tyranny, proved inadequate. National government could not effectively handle national defense, transportation infrastructure, or interstate commerce. Its failure led to the Constitutional Convention 1787 and a new federal system. Then they move on quickly to talk about the US Constitution and federalism. So they argue that the framers balanced political power with individual liberty, tyranny versus anarchy, or tyranny of the majority, which we'll talk about in a moment. Federalism, to them, is defined by a power sharing relationship between federal and state governments, kind of like a separation of powers between the federal government and state governments. The enumerated or named powers of the federal government regulate interstate commerce, coin money, declare war, and the necessary and proper clause. Concurrent powers shared by both federal and state governments lay taxes, incur debt, make enforce laws, establish courts. Powers reserved for the states, ratify amendments, run elections, police power. That's not entirely true, right? There are federal law enforcement agencies as well. All powers not denied to states are given to the federal government. They provide a table here, which pretty much just says what I just said, but if you want a different presentation for that. Now I'm going to turn here. They don't really talk about this, but I'm going to turn to Federalist Number 10 by James Madison. The Federalist Papers, if you don't know, and this isn't to really talk about the whole history of the Constitution, though I'll kind of bring some of that in later on into the class. But the Federalist Papers were basically newspaper articles written urging for the ratification of the Constitution, for the states essentially to approve of the Constitution. And there are many of them. Arguably, the most important is Federalist Number 10, which is where Madison deals with the issue of factions, basically groups that he argue have kind of like a selfish interest that is opposed to the public interest, which is, of course, always sort of vaguely defined. Interestingly enough, Madison will discuss the possibility of majority factions as well. So now you have a faction that is made up of a majority of the people, yet somehow he's arguing that they can still have interests that are opposed to the public interest. Well, isn't the interest of the majority almost by definition the public interest? Madison argues not. A lesser known part of this, but is also very important, is that Madison is quite clear that although factional conflict can come from many different areas, the most important source of faction, he says, is basically over economic interests. And this is a very fascinating insight, especially considering that this is written, something like 30 years before Karl Marx is even born, and about 60 years before he writes the Communist Manifesto or co-authors it with Friedrich Engels. Yet, quite clearly here, if you read this passage, you can see that Madison anticipates a lot of what Marxists would associate with the idea of class struggle, which of course is very much identified with Marx as well. But you can see Marx did not necessarily, invent this idea either. So again, he writes now, the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Now, by property, he doesn't just mean like ownership of land or anything like that, but basically wealth, anything that is valuable and useful to people. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors. This is a very important political conflict at the time of the Constitution as well, fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes. He even uses the term class here, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves a spirit of party and faction, the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. So again, Madison's views are very similar to some of the approaches that we talked about last class, particularly people like Parenti, who argue that the class struggle or class conflict is at the center of most policy debates. I would say that the major difference, though, of course, between Madison and Marx, Madison's views are very similar to other philosophical figures like Aristotle as well, is that Madison, obviously argues that there's no end to class conflict, whereas Marx argued that there is at least one possible pathway out of this. Madison's also quite clearly, or maybe it's not so clear from here, but it will be if you read more of him, clearly arguing from the point of view of the elite, the point of view of the ruling class, essentially, whereas, of course, Marx is arguing from the perspective of the working class. Here's where Madison talks about this idea of a majority faction. So he argues if a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, meaning the system of electing representatives, the constitutional, checks and balances and things like that, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. Now, even that is a bit of a strong assumption that he's making here, by the way. I don't think that's necessarily true at all. He goes on, it may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, this is all just one long paragraph, so that's why I included it like this. The form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. So, most people would probably assume that the majority will is the public interest. But here he's talking about basically where the majority can sort of, trample over the rights of the minority. And you might think, well, okay, well, that's kind of a good insight. But what a minority is Madison thinking about? Is he talking about the population of slaves in the United States? Certainly not. He's basically talking about, again, the property owners, the wealthy elites who own all the wealth essentially and own all the property of value. Now, at this time, the United States had yet to really undergo industrialization. So it was mostly merchants and landowners and slave owners and some other commercial interests as well. But basically, yes, the idea was to watch out for the interests of these groups, to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and form of popular government is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Now, what are some of the things that he identifies with a majority faction? He writes a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. So what does he associate with the majority faction? That they might vote for legislation to forgive debts, which we've talked about already, for an equal division of property, which is more radical, or even perhaps for the abolition of property ownership of the means of production. But he associates them as wicked, wicked ideas. And he's not saying this with a Boston accent either. He doesn't mean it in a good way. To him, the idea that people would actually seek to abolish debt or to divide wealth in a more equitable way is quite literally a wicked idea, basically an evil idea to him. And this view basically characterized most of the other founders, some having even more extreme views than Madison. Madison did so much change his views and come over more to the Jeffersonian side, who was a little bit opposed to this characterization of things, but that came after this. So we'll talk a little bit more about the founding of the Constitution. I don't want to get off topic and lose sight of the focus on policy here, but since this class is sort of devoted to the constitutional framework that allows, that essentially structures the policymaking process, I think some discussion of that might be necessary. But let me finish rounding out the chapter, which is fairly short here. So then they talk about the evolution of policymaking in the United States. The primary political conflict, they argue, in U.S. history is a proper balance between federal and state power. I don't know if that's necessarily the primary conflict. That certainly is one important issue, though. From the 1780s to the 1930s, very long period of time. They completely kind of gloss over the Civil War here, which is a little strange. But anyway, they say states more powerful in domestic policy. Again, that kind of briefly changed during the Civil War and for some years afterwards, but then it did kind of regress back to that, I guess you could say. Federal government focused on infrastructure, subsidies for westward expansion, tariffs, patents, and currency. There were few coercive policies, again, kind of leaving aside the Civil War, and mainly assisted economic growth. Post-World War II, U.S. emerged as economic military superpower. Great Depression lessons increased demand for federal regulation. So the kind of exceptional policies that were created during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the so-called New Deal, at least some aspects of those things were carried over even after World War II, although it was kind of watered down as well. The drivers of federal growth, the complexity of the U.S. economy, global economic integration, civil rights movements for minorities and women. To give an example, in the 1870s, railroads charged high rates to farmers. States couldn't regulate interstate commerce. The federal government then created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which, again, if you go back to the categories of policy that we talked about last class, could be considered both a constituent and a regulatory policy. They go a little more into this now. The New Deal period of the 1930s, the Great Depression gave President FDR political capital for dramatic change, meaning that he was given leeway, some openness to basically, create fairly, radical laws during this period of time. And this, of course, is in the aftermath of several years of the Depression, where the incumbent Republican government under Herbert Hoover was almost completely powerless and pretty much was completely ineffective at doing anything to sort of deal with or moderate or cushion the economic impacts of the Great Depression. So coming into this after about 3 years of this, FDR had space that almost no other president had to create fairly dramatic laws, at least for that period of time. The New Deal programs regulated prices, created jobs, regulated banks, established collective bargaining rights for unions, created the first federal minimum wage, created Social Security, which is basically a combination of retirement and unemployment compensation. It marked a new era of federalism. Federal government gained significantly more policymaking power. And it's kind of never really gone back to what it was prior to that. Then they jumped to the Great Society of the 1960s and 1970s, a series of federal initiatives under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Funny enough, I mean, Kennedy and Johnson were Democrats. Nixon was a Republican, but did for the most part carry out the same ideas. Um, Policies: the Civil Rights Act 1964, the Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, Medicare, and Head Start were all basically created during this period of time. Unique characteristics: extensive use of grant and aid, federal money to state and local governments for transportation, housing, healthcare, and racial integration. This is essentially where the federal government provides a revenue or money, as it says, basically to state and local governments, which establishes a kind of financial dependence on the federal government as well. Interestingly enough, many of the so-called red states in this country are the most dependent on this federal money as well, although they rarely acknowledge it, it seems. Increased shared policymaking powers between federal and state governments. Later notable policies: the war on drugs, which really begins under Nixon, but they attribute it more to Reagan. NAFTA under Clinton, the North American Free Trade Agreement, No Child Left Behind, and the Affordable Care Act in 2010. So it's just kind of a hodgepodge of different things. Then they begin to focus on actors in the policy process. So there are two groups: the constitutional actors created by the Constitution, and the non-constitutional actors, those who are outside of the government but are seeking to influence it. So what are the different constitutional actors? So you have the Congress, of course, which is established in Article 1 of the Constitution. They point out this is the longest and most detailed article. Framers intended Congress to be the epicenter of policymaking. Functions were to pass legislation, appropriate all revenue, which they call the power of the purse, which many people call that, oversee the executive branch. It is a bicameral legislature, meaning that made up of both the House and Senate. And within both the House and Senate, you have a breakdown into different committees, like Agricultural Committee, the Appropriations Committee, Armed Services, Judiciary, etc. Again, your textbook has a complete list of that, where you can just go to the House and Senate website and find that as well. I did not include it here. Power of the purse: Congress controls all federal spending, a significant check on executive and judicial branches. Revenue bills must originate in the House. The House is supposed to be the more democratic branch of the Congress, based on the population of the states, whereas the Senate, of course, has equal representation among the states, regardless of the size of the state or the population. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act in 1974 created the Congressional Budget Office, which is supposed to provide nonpartisan fiscal expertise. But of course, as we know, the idea of any institution of government being truly non-partisan or non-ideological is probably does not exist. Congress approves creation of different executive departments. Another example of constituent policy, and oversees the implementation. The President, Article 2. Fewer enumerated or named powers than the Congress, but has elastic language, executive power, meaning there's a sort of a broad interpretation of what executive power is. Faithfully execute laws, allows for the later expansion of the executive branch, which would again occur probably most dramatically during the Civil War, and then again in the 1930s, whereas it basically stayed at a large size since then. Controls the federal bureaucracy, almost a $5 trillion budget with 3 million employees. The president can issue executive orders. These are directives managing federal operations. They have the force of law, but they do not require congressional approval. They are often, however, challenged in court. In theory, it is to allow the president to carry out already existing laws. So when the president issues an executive order, it's doing so under the theory that their executive order is allowing them to carry out a law that's already been passed. Broad foreign policy powers. The president receives ambassadors from foreign countries, is the head of state and government, negotiates treaties, which requires a 2/3 Senate ratification as well, uses executive agreements when supermajority unlikely. This Senate power to approve of treaties and to approve of presidential appointments as well, which they don't really point out, is a very crucial power given to the Senate. As far as its treaty power goes, not a lot of people know this, but after the Civil War, the United States actually signed a treaty. The president at that time, Ulysses S. Grant, signed a treaty to actually formally annex the Dominican Republic. It was only basically blocked because it was not approved by the Senate. Had it not been for that, again, actually signed by the president of the United States would have then essentially taken over the Dominican Republic, much as it did later on with Puerto Rico. It's interesting to consider how that historical pathway would have played out, or would have really made a difference at all. Budget and Accounting Act 1921 gave president formal budget submission power. The OMB provides estimates. That's the Office of Management and Budget. So much like the CBO plays a very sort of similar role in sort of overseeing and advising over basically the budgetary process. Regulatory agencies, rulemaking power gives president control over implementation. So the president can, the Congress passes the laws, but the president basically executes the laws. That's where the term executive comes from. And so how well the laws are actually implemented are crucially affected by the power of the president to appoint people that are essentially tasked with carrying out these laws. Then you move on to the courts, Article 3, supposedly the least dangerous branch. Again, I don't know if that's true. No explicit policymaking power. Yet they themselves have already acknowledged that courts do have policymaking power. And they cite the example of Obergefell v. Hodges as an example of that. Relies on other branches for enforcement. Well, that is true. It's the least proactive branch of government, but in some ways it's the most powerful. And this power is basically contained in this idea of judicial review here, which is established in Marbury v. Madison, 1803, a very early and very important Supreme Court case. Supreme Court cases are usually noted by this, someone versus someone kind of thing, or sometimes states and even the federal government itself. The power to determine constitutionality of congressional legislation and presidential actions, not in Article 3. So Article 3 does not actually give the court the power of judicial review. But basically what it is, the court basically concluded that it has that power as a result of Marbury v. Madison. But what it does is it essentially allows the court to strike down laws or actions taken by the president. So it can strike down laws or parts of laws passed by the Congress and block actions taken by the executive branch. A very powerful ability, which, again, the Supreme Court is virtually unique in having. I mean, other lower level courts have that power as well, but the ultimate authority is basically given to the Supreme Court, of which there's no higher court that you can appeal to after that. Judicial review then obviously gives federal courts significant policy influence over both federal and state actions. The court's focus has evolved the first century on federal-state relations and slavery, post-World War II on civil liberties for women and minorities. Now, again, interesting enough, the textbook doesn't really discuss the court's role in defending corporations, or again, defending the economic interests of the wealthy in the United States as well, which has done a very good job of, and has been almost consistent on throughout its entire history. Judicial restraint. The court should not push views unless obvious constitutional violation, less direct influence. So these are sort of different schools of thought on what role the court should play. Some argue very sort of limited roles of the court. Some argue that the court should play more of an activist role. Court should actively solve policy problems ignored by elected branches. Now, interestingly enough, it's not necessarily a liberal or conservative issue. Basically, whoever's in power will tend to, favor a more activist court. And when their partisan group is not in power, tend to, oppose the courts taking a more active role. Then you have the non-constitutional actors. And interesting enough, they start off with the bureaucracy. Now, the idea is that these are groups basically outside of the government. I mean, the bureaucracy is not really outside of the government, but it's not necessarily something that's created through the Constitution as well. It is kind of, I would argue, a sort of logical extension, essentially, of executive power. Right? It's to allow the executive branch essentially to carry out and implement the laws passed by the Congress. But again, these are non-elected professionals responsible for carrying out policies. So I guess this is the most crucial thing here is that uh, members of the federal bureaucracy are part of the government, but they're not elected by the people. They are basically appointed officials, appointed by the president in most instances. The sociologist Max Weber, or Weber, as you'd say here, associates there are six characteristics of bureaucracy. Specialization and division of labor, so different offices handle different things. There's a clear hierarchy between higher level and lower level. There are formal rules which are adhered to pretty strictly for the most part. There are records of everything. It's an impersonal relationship. The person that you're dealing with does not treat you like your friend, as I'm sure anyone that's ever had to deal with a bureaucracy already knows, and is supposedly based on merit based professionalism as well. Or basically, there are sort of metrics or measurements of performance that determine somebody's advancement. In the post progressive era, this is after the basically up until World War I, basically. Civil service reforms created a more professional, technically proficient bureaucracy. So this is considered one of the achievements of the progressive era. Bureaucrats interpret laws, influence policy formation, and are most influential during implementation. Example, the ACA legislation, that's the Affordable Care Act, 1,000 pages. Subsequent bureaucratic rules made it over 20,000 pages. Bureaucrats are both informed and accountable to public institutions. Then you have citizens, of course, whose most effective way to influence policy is through voting, which is interesting that they associate that, not maybe something like a direct action or something like that. It's certainly maybe the easiest way to influence policy, but that's assuming that the policymakers, basically heed what the voters want. Elect leaders who share their preferences. Well, yeah, I mean, unless you don't have any choices for leaders who share your preferences, and then you're forced to choose between what exists. Public opinion influences of representative government. Again, that's not always true. I mean, there are plenty of instances where, I mean, there are actually pretty wild divergences between public opinion and government. I don't have any examples here, but we could talk about this more as we get into some of the issues. But healthcare seems like most people basically favor single payer healthcare. Most people are opposed to these foreign wars. Kidnapping the Venezuelan president, going to war with Iran. People are very negative now towards Israel as a result of its genocide over Gaza. So, yet the government doesn't seem to heed what the public wants on these issues at all. High opinion policy congruence, they say, on salient issues. Again, this is assuming that the government essentially listens to public opinion. Now, I'm not saying the public opinion doesn't have any influence at all, but it's a very sort of muddled and indirect relationship at best. And if anything, it takes a very long time for public opinion to really, push the government into any way. It might be true if public opinion is sustained enough for a long enough period of time, then it can influence the government. But otherwise, public opinion also tends to be very volatile as well and can wildly, shift. Anyway, citizens are entitled to First Amendment and other constitutional protections: speech, press, petition, assembly. I mean, again, it's very hard to read any of this stuff and talk about these things as if they're established facts when there's certainly evidence to suggest that's not the case. And at best, these are not always followed up on or guaranteed. And in many ways, the government falls short. I mean, I don't know how else to correct what they're saying here, they're just stating certain things as more or less established facts when there's much more uncertainty, I guess, around these uh, relations. Civic activism, marches, protests, influence policy. Again, the 1963 March on Washington later led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Again, there were a lot of other things that happened in between that as well. Finally, they mentioned that civil disobedience is also used to achieve policy goals, but they kind of treat that for last. Interest groups influence policy favoring specific populations, constitutional protections for free expression and direct contact with government. According to Robert Dahl, who developed what was known as pluralist theory, there are multiple groups competing, actually furthers the public good. So you don't have just one dominant group, you have a multiplicity of dominant groups. Again, I mean, to what extent is that true? These are all certainly things that could be debated, but I'm not going to necessarily do that right here. Lobbying, direct attempts to influence votes of policymakers through meetings, campaign contributions, and gifts. Recent court decisions equate campaign spending with First Amendment speech. Basically, money is speech, and corporations are people, so they can basically now spend as much money as they want, basically trying to influence elections, trying to influence the votes of members of Congress through lobbying as well. They write that information is a commodity. Groups without large budgets can provide policy expertise. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spent $77 million lobbying. The NRA spent $77 million lobbying, and the NRA. I think I repeated myself there. Whoops. So moving on to the media. First Amendment protects free expression and marketplace of ideas. Media educates the populace, provides theoretically nonpartisan information, and serves a watchdog function, like the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which was released to the press. Agenda setting: media determines which issues are covered, influencing public perception of importance. Again, they give an example of the 1965 coverage of Selma to Montgomery March, leading to a great public outcry over the violence inflicted upon the protesters, which they say played a role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they give a case study of the origins of U.S. healthcare policy with a focus on the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. They once again go back to the late 19th century. They talk about germ theory and medical advances created significant medical expenses. U.S. healthcare evolution differed from other developed nations due to faith in free market capitalism and limited government, plus distrust of central government efficiency. So the U.S., unlike many other countries, has not pursued socialized medicine or single payer healthcare. Instead, leaves healthcare to be a commodity, essentially a for-profit industry, which creates massive problems, obviously. So they talk about the role various presidents have played in healthcare. Harry Truman was the first president to support universal comprehensive health insurance, but was defeated by Cold War fears of socialism. Then in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson expanded the Social Security Act to create Medicare, which would cover seniors and disabled people, and created Medicaid, which would provide assistance to poor people. Made federal government the largest purchaser of healthcare as well. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s deregulated various aspects of the healthcare industry, including the pharmaceutical industry, which is now allowed to advertise directly to the public and things like that. Expanded private insurance. Created COBRA, which allowed former employers to keep coverage if they paid the full premium, which of course could be extremely expensive. Then Clinton in 1993 to 2001 tried to draft the Health Security Act, which would create universal but still privately owned healthcare through private insurance companies, failed. Successfully signed HIPAA, which created stronger protections of privacy of medical records and things like that, and as well as CHIP, which provides children's insurance. Then they begin to talk about the role that Obama played over the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in 2010. It prohibited denial for pre-existing conditions, ended lifetime limits, extended parental coverage to age 26, mandated essential benefits, an individual mandate, Medicaid expansion, state option, which was later rejected by several states, as well as subsidies to pay for health care and health insurance as well. There was a big political drama over this. The Democrats had 59 seats plus one independent, basically gave them 60 votes. This is crucial because this allowed them to pass things through the Senate without fear of the filibuster, which is a tactic developed in the Senate to basically delay or block essentially the passage of legislation. Senator Arlen Specter switched parties in April 2009 to join the Democrats. However, Senator Ted Kennedy died in August 2009, giving them only 59 seats, which is still enough to pass most regular legislation. The problem is that basically since the 1970s, the Senate has essentially switched to a 60-vote rule, essentially, to pass legislation. Without 60 votes, they won't even try to pass many things, especially something like this. It passed the House in November 2009, passed the Senate in December. Then Scott Brown won the Massachusetts special election in January 2010. Republicans gained a seat, lost their supermajority before the conference committee. So what happens here is that the House and Senate passed versions of the Affordable Care Act, but they were not the exact same version. They had to be then sort of reconciled or combined into one identical piece of legislation before it could be passed. For a bill to become law, it has to pass in identical form through both the House and Senate, and again, then be signed into law by the president. What happened, though, is that during this period of time, the Democrats lost their 60 votes in the Senate. So during the essential revote over this, they would no longer have the 60th vote. Democrats circumvented by having House pass exact Senate bill 2019 to 2012. President signed in March 23rd, 2010. Supreme Court upheld individual mandate as a tax, allowed Medicaid expansion, but made it voluntary for states. Trump in 2017 attempted to repeal and replace with the American Health Care Act, but this failed, reduced outreach funding, and removed individual mandate penalty, which was later struck down by the Supreme Court. So the Affordable Care Act is still basically the law of the land. Chapter summary. The Constitution created federalism, which has evolved over time. Initially, the federal government had few domestic responsibilities. Demand for services expanded, federal power. Constitutional actors, three branches have intertwined power, checks and balances, making policy difficult. Non-constitutional actors also influence policy as well. All right, so that more or less covers their chapter, but again, I want to sort of get into providing a little more context. So for this, again, I'm going to turn to Michael Parenti's book, Democracy for the Few. This time cover chapter 2 pretty quickly, because I think he provides much more historical context surrounding the passage of the Constitution. So again, essentially what we get out of this is that the constitutional framework essentially sets the foundation for how the policymaking process works. But let's talk a little bit more about what led to the passage of the Constitution. So what's the purpose of examining the Constitution? Understanding U.S. politics, he requires studying its origin and structure. The Constitution was designed to create a strong central government influenced by ideas like those of Adam Smith, who linked government to protection of property and wealth. So again, we're not concerned overall with American politics, but particularly how the Constitution basically sets the foundation, like I said, for what the policymaking process is. Class power in early America. Parenti points out that early America was not an egalitarian country. There was already, high levels of inequality, and always has been um, ever since its founding. Large holdings concentrated among a small elite. Wealthy merchants and landowners dominated economic life. So again, this precedes the era of industrialization, which followed, not too long afterwards. But by this point in time, merchants, particularly in the North, and landowners, slave owners, basically in the South, dominated economic life. You also, of course, had large non-slave owning landowners in the North as well. Very, profitable, farmers and stuff. Political participation was highly restricted, though, at this time. Voting limited mostly to property owning white males. Women, enslaved people, Native Americans, indentured servants, and even poor whites were all excluded from voting. Holding office required, and still requires, of course, substantial wealth. Media, newspapers largely served elite commercial interests. Elite influence before the Constitution. Wealthy classes, landowners, merchants, bankers dominated politics after the American Revolution. They sought stronger central authority, protection of property and financial interest. Under the Articles of Confederation, federal government lacked taxation power, could not effectively manage debt or enforce policies. Motivations of the constitutional framers. Delegates were predominantly wealthy elites, the gentlemen, as they like to call themselves. Their key goals were to resolve interstate economic conflicts, protect commerce and international trade, advance interests of affluent classes, defend wealth from demands of the lower classes. Fear of popular unrest, for example, Shays's rebellion, which essentially was the event that's essentially was the catalyst for the Constitutional Convention, which started off basically as an attempt to reform or change the Articles of Confederation, but basically then became a whole new document. Was basically really set off by things like this. There were uprisings by working class people, many of them at Revolutionary War veterans. So these are people who had, military experience as well, who were heavily in debt to many of these, financial interests, which were, of course, supported, or people like Alexander Hamilton essentially, function as like the mouthpiece of, basically, were profiting at the expense of these smaller farmers and former veterans, like I said, and many of them took up arms against it. And the government was not really doing a job of dealing with these things. I mean, they had a hard time even putting down the rebellions, but also, of course, more importantly, dealing with the the underlying economic issues, which basically led to this in the first place. Conditions of the lower classes. Many Americans were small farmers, laborers, or indebted individuals. They faced common hardships, high taxes and interest rates, debt, imprisonment, loss of property through foreclosure. So again, would have been things, Shays' people, Shays himself and his supporters basically would have been dealing with widespread unrest, protests, riots, and armed resistance. Containing democracy. Framers aim to preserve the appearance of popular government while limiting its substance. Concerned about majority faction, again, which we've already talked about, or the poor majority, basically threatening property or wealth, basically. I mean, wealth is probably a better term to use. Government was designed then to protect the unequal distribution of wealth and to prevent redistributive demands, something which is both function very well at. This is an interesting place to pause and to consider the idea of what is the government really for. I mean, many people talk about the government, in other words, in being a dysfunctional government, but this is assuming that the government is doing something wrong, right? It's not carrying out its role properly. That's essentially what function is, right? It's the role or the purpose of something. But if the government was designed, as Parenti argues here, to protect wealth and to prevent the redistribution of that wealth, they could argue it's functioning very fine, right? It's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. So depending upon your view of what the government was really set up for, will sort of influence how you perceive the government as being functional or dysfunctional. Class-based view of government, again, thinkers like James Madison, we've already covered, argued that society is divided between property owners and non-owners. The government's role is to protect those property rights. Wealth accumulation is seen as a core freedom to be safeguarded, the freedom to own property, essentially. The constitutional design favors elites. Key economic powers granted to Congress: taxation, regulation of commerce, control of currency and debt management. Policies favored investors, creditors, and merchants. Public debt repayment enriched wealthy speculators as well. So an interesting thing that happened during this period of time is that many of the veterans of the American Revolution bought bonds, right? The government needed to raise money. One tried and true method by which the government raises money is by issuing bonds, which basically you buy these bonds. So you essentially give them money and then they pay you back with interest when the bond matures. The problem with this is that many of the Revolutionary War bonds had become worthless in the intervening years, particularly under the system of the Articles of Confederation. What Hamilton knew about, and this is kind of like an early example of sort of like insider trading or something like that. Hamilton told all his friends on Wall Street, basically, hey, buy up all these bonds. All these people own them, but they're not cashing them in. They can't cash them in because they're basically worthless. The government doesn't have the money to pay for these things. Buy them all up now, and then when the new government is created under the Constitution, the government is going to pay off this debt, and the people are going to make a shitload of money. And that's basically exactly what they did, and that's exactly what happened. So the people who, early on supported the revolution got screwed, of course, and the people who, the financial interest who bought up all these bonds basically made a killing. It's probably also worth pointing out that probably a lot of these financial interests probably would have supported the British during the war as well. Of course, New York City was almost like the home base for the British while they were trying to fight against the revolution as well. The states, of course, were restricted from interfering with contracts or issuing their own currency as well, which of course gave more financial power to the federal government. The Constitution protects slavery, which categorizes it as essentially just another form of property, of ownership. Slavery explicitly accommodated the 3/5 compromise, increased representation of slave states. Slave trade was protected until at least 1808. And of course, continued, illegally afterwards. Fugitive slave clause required return of escaped slaves. Slavery, again, treated as a form of property. Use of state power against unrest. The federal government was empowered to suppress insurrections, maintain military forces, both of which it used, particularly to suppress insurrections during this period of time. Later used to break labor strikes and unrest as well as you get further into the 19th century. The system was designed to prevent unified popular control. So you have your separation of powers, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. You have the checks and balances which exist between each branch. Again, I'm not going to go into detail with that now. But we've talked about some of it already, like how legislation is passed and things like that. It was a bicameral legislature, which we've already talked about, that House and Senate. Very difficult amendment process. Basically requiring 2/3 of both the House and Senate to pass an amendment, and then must be further ratified by 3/4 of the states as well, making it very hard to get the Constitution amendment. That's probably why it's only been amended 27 times. The first 10 being basically added, very early on. Majority rule constrained by multiple veto points. Establishes a system of what could maybe at best be called indirect democracy, limited direct popular influence. The senators, again, were originally chosen by state legislatures. So the Senate is already an undemocratic branch by giving smaller, less populated states, many of which were also slave owning states, equal representation to the larger states, which have larger populations and thus represent more people. Um, Besides this, people didn't even really originally get to vote for their senators as well. The senators were completely chosen by the state governments. And it wasn't until the 20th century where I think about 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment that senators were directly elected by the people. The president is selected via the Electoral College. The Supreme Court is appointed for life. So that's sort of like the trifecta of basically undemocratic institutions within the federal government: the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court. Only the House of Representatives was directly elected. Even then, the electorate was highly restricted. So, many people, as I've already covered, were excluded from this. You should also mention, again, the issue of gerrymandering as well, which developed also very early on, being named from a politician from this era. But basically allows states to set up the district boundaries in a way which favors one party over the other as well. According to recent reports published by the Brennan Center at NYU Law School, Republicans pretty much have a more or less permanent extra sort of handicap in every House election, being given extra seats that they would not have if not for the effects of this gerrymandering, based on their analysis of it. Elites had strong distrust of the masses. Many framers viewed democracy in a negative way. They saw the common people as unstable and irrational, preferred rule by the wealthy and the well-born. Probably no figure better reflects this than Alexander Hamilton, who several times would basically, sound off against the people. So he writes, for example, the voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. He writes that the people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. So again, not the best advocate for government by the people here. But his views were not, universal either, though I would argue that they tended to be the majority viewpoint, at least among the framers of the Constitution. It was a elite-dominated constitutional process. The convention excluded the lower classes entirely. Debates occurred among elite factions, merchants, slaveholders, etc., bankers. No representation of workers, farmers, or enslaved people. The ratification process was not submitted to a popular vote, so the Constitution was never actually approved by the people of the country. It was ratified by state conventions dominated by elites who used various methods to influence the vote: propaganda, intimidation, threats, and actual, physical violence, has been attested by some eyewitnesses during this period of time, and limited electorate participation as well. So this often leads to a debate as to what were the motives of the framers. Were they just purely acting out of their own self-interest, or were they trying to build a stronger country? Or are these things, in fact, not exclusive to each other, which is basically where Parenti comes out, and I think he is correct. So he references the historian Charles Beard, who argued that the framers were only acting in their own class interest. The counter-argument, again, framers also believed they were building a strong nation. Class interest and nation-building goals were intertwined. So they're not exclusive to each other, right? Building a stronger nation is advancing the class interests of the founders as well, because you're building a stronger and wealthier country. How would that not be to the benefit of the ruling class in the United States? Secrecy and elite control. The convention was conducted in secret. There's in fact very little record or transcript of it. Most people rely on James Madison's notes, just notes he took down as the proceedings of the convention were playing out. And these were only published decades later. So no one really knew at the time what was going on in the Constitutional Convention. But most people tend to think that, a lot of statements, some of the statements by Hamilton, where I believe actually made during the convention, kind of sets the character and tone for what a lot of the debate was during this period of time. Now, presumably, Madison or Hamilton rather must have been arguing against somebody as well. But most of the delegates openly expressed class biases, mostly towards, again, the wealthy elite. The Constitution is a fundamentally conservative document, is designed to limit popular power, preserve the existing class structure, and protect wealth accumulation. Liberty is defined primarily as freedom to acquire and control a property. Despite elitist design, Parenti does identify some progressive features of it. A written constitution limiting government power, no property requirement for federal office, but voting did in some instances at the state level. But those were quickly abolished. Fixed terms for elected officials, no religious tests for office as well. Something which seems much more relevant now, as well as maybe fixed terms for elected officials. The Bill of Rights, added due to popular pressure, guarantees civil liberties like freedom of speech, religion, trial rights, etc., protection from government abuse, reflects compromise between elites and popular demands. This was not originally part of the Constitution, but was added very soon after. Secular foundation, the Constitution contains no reference at all to Christianity. Founders like Jefferson, John Adams, Madison, and Franklin all expressed skepticism toward organized religion as well. The system explicitly favors republicanism over monarchy. The Constitution completely rejects any notion of a monarchy or an aristocracy. Essentially, the power should be essentially inherited or passed on without, the mechanism of voting. Established a republic without titles of nobility. Doesn't Mark Twain have a famous quote about how in love Americans are with the British ruling family, though? Limits on elite power. The framers were powerful but constrained. They did still face widespread unrest and resistance, so they were fearful of pushing things too much. Had to make concessions to ensure legitimacy and stability. So Parenti ultimately sees the Constitution as a product of class struggle. It's not completely determined by the interest of the wealthy class, well, although they do probably get most of what they want, I guess you could say. But he sees that there are some concessions made in this as well. It is not purely an elite imposition. It is a result of conflict between elites and popular forces. Democratic elements emerge from pressure from below. So the Constitution reflects the protection of elite economic interest, a fear of mass democracy, but it does contain some strategic concessions to popular demands. It is both a tool of class power, but a product of ongoing social struggle. So with that, I think it would be interesting to turn back to this idea of structural relational analysis that we talked about last class. And now maybe we can apply it to the Constitution itself and how it kind of pretty much permanently establishes a structure which favors capitalist interest. One of the limitations of the structural view of politics and policy is that it tends to take the structure as just this sort of given thing, right? The structure exists, and then just try to analyze what kind of force it exerts upon actors who are trying to act within the structure. But where does the structure come from? It doesn't just emerge out of nowhere, right? It is a creation of people as well, not by one person or even one group of people, but something that collectively sort of takes shape over time. However, as we've established, I think by this point, um, the political structure of the United States itself was from its very origins um, tilted towards the interest of the wealthy elite, which is transformed over time. It is not the exact same capitalist class now as it was back then. I mean, you could even argue to what extent a true capitalist class existed in the United States at this time, where at least a significant portion of the country was under an agricultural slave economy. And the merchants. I mean, Marx talks about merchant capital um, and various sub divisions of the idea of capital, but the idea of industrial capital developing in the United States again would proceed relatively soon after this and really pick up speed after the Civil War. Um, but in any event, it does appear as if the political structure has always been tilted to favor the interests of the wealthy elite, which eventually became the kind of capitalist class that we would generally associate with modern day economics. Um, so again, the Constitution is not a neutral set of rules. It establishes a strategically selective terrain that systematically privileges certain actors' interests and strategies over others. So here you have a pretty detailed breakdown of it right here. So a lot of it we've already covered, though, of course, so there's no need to necessarily go through it. It's more of a summation of what we've talked about, how the separation of powers basically plays to the interest of the wealthy class, checks and balances, prevents redistribution of wealth and things like that. The structure of the House and Senate, the Electoral College, life tenure for judges, and so on and so forth. The necessary and proper clause allows Congress to expand its powers, so it does to a certain extent privilege flexible state action, but only within a capitalist framework. So it's very much hemmed in by that as well. The supremacy clause, federal law overrides state law, which you could argue privileges national capital over local popular experiments that might challenge property rights, and so on and so forth, even including the 3/5 compromise. Again, with the idea that the Bill of Rights also was sort of one of the only real concessions made to the working class, as well as maybe no property qualification for federal office as well. Of course, the more significant one being the Bill of Rights. Now, again, even though there's no property qualification for office, it doesn't necessarily mean that more working class people are going to get into office, right? I mean, you still have to be, and this was true back then as well, extremely wealthy to even be able to afford to run, right? Running for office is an extremely expensive thing, as all the things we've learned about with campaign financing go. So even if there was no explicit property qualification for federal office, in reality, the poor were pretty much excluded from holding federal office, pretty much all the way through, to the present day. The Bill of Rights, though, obviously much more significant concession being made. So the framers feared a majority faction, again, as Parenti argues, the poor, a majority threatening their wealth. The Constitution's structure is designed to contain democracy, preserve the appearance of popular government while limiting its substance. So we've already talked about the various different groups, but that more or less sets up the structure. And Parenti has talked about to some extent, how the Constitutional Convention and ratification process turned out. But now, if we look at who are some of the key groups surrounding the passage of the Constitution, again, you have wealthy landowners, merchants, bankers. They have large property holdings, commercial networks, political connections, control of media, newspapers back then, and legal expertise as well. Their interest was to protect their wealth, suppress debt relief and paper money, regulate commerce, nationally prevent popular uprisings. Again, we've talked about how the Constitutional Convention was conducted in secret and the sort of elite dominated interest that it served. That was one group. Then you have the Southern planters, who were also basically represented, of course, obviously in the Constitutional Convention, but already from the beginning felt themselves to be almost like an aggrieved minority group. And so the Constitutional Convention was mainly a compromise, basically, to get the Southern slaveholders to basically adopt the Constitution. As it says here, accept federal commerce power in exchange for fugitive slave clause and 3/5 clause, and to protect the slave trade until 1808. So, of course, their main interest was to protect slavery as a form of property. But then you have the small farmers, um, the potential majority people, the ability to protest, riot, resist foreclosure, demand debt relief. Their main interest, again, was relief of their debt. They wanted to use paper money, which had an inflationary effect, but would basically literally put more money in the hands of people. Protection from foreclosure. Um, their main strategy, since they lacked other forms of power, is to engage in direct action. And again, they were later the main pressure point for the passage of the Bill of Rights. Then you have basically people who are completely excluded from this. Women, enslaved people, Native Americans. The only way that they could resist was often through violent methods, slave revolts, attacks by Native Americans. Women obviously pursued other forms of resistance and had some ability to organize within the society, but basically played no real role in shaping the Constitution itself. So again, Prenti argues that the framers acted out of their class interest, not simply nation building. They feared democracy and designed the Constitution to protect wealth. Counter argument, framers also believed in a strong nation, but as Prenti notes, class interest and nation building were intertwined. A strong nation would protect property and commerce. And of course, you could then extend this logic to, essentially becoming a global superpower as well, by the way. So how does the Constitution shape policy outcomes over time? The SRA asks, given the structure and the strategic selectivity which comes out of that, and the agency of various forces, what outcomes are systematically produced? So the immediate outcomes, from 1789 to the early 1800s, federal government gains power to tax, regulate commerce, pay debts, which basically benefited the banking interests, the creditors, and the merchants. Hamilton's financial plan, federal assumption of state debts, national bank enriches wealthy speculators who bought depreciated war bonds. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 was suppressed by federal troops, demonstrates state power against popular resistance. The Alien and Sedition Acts are passed in 1798, used to silence opposition, shows how constitutional powers can be deployed against dissent. Slavery entrenched, which basically, of course, lasted until the Civil War. Then, as you move through the 19th and 20th centuries, right, you have the various times where policy began to shift, and what role the Constitution played in influencing or mediating the shift. So the Civil War and Reconstruction period, which lasts up until 1877, the abolition of slavery, the passage of the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, and the Reconstruction period following that, the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and things like that. Now the Constitution, arguably, again, and the lack of democratic oversight of it, and the ability of minority interests like slave owning interests to prevail in the system, arguably helped bring about the Civil War. Because these changes were only achieved through violent means, not through normal constitutional processes. The 14th Amendment's equal protection clause was later used to protect corporate property. So, in a very small amount of time, the government sort of gives up on its Reconstruction efforts. And then the Reconstruction amendments are not properly enforced, and in many ways are, again, even sort of co-opted to protect corporate property as well. During the progressive era and the New Deal, you see various shifts in policy as well towards the beginnings of a regulatory state, and with the New Deal, it kind of welfare state. But again, this was only achieved through mass mobilization. This was not achieved. I mean, it was eventually achieved by normal constitutional means, but it took an extremely long period of time. And the massive amounts of popular pressure brought upon it made these things possible. The Supreme Court still, later struck down New Deal laws, so it did dilute somewhat the New Deal. And arguably, the Supreme Court came pretty close to blocking the New Deal. Another important thing to point out would be FDR's dependence upon Southern Democrats, who were very strong segregationists during this period of time, and how the New Deal would not have been passed without their support, as well as been written about by, for example, the book Fear Itself by Ira Katznelson. The Civil Rights Movement, again, achieved through extra constitutional pressure, marches, civil disobedience, protests. The courts helped, but only after popular mobilization made it necessary. The Constitution's fragmentation allowed Southern segregationists to filibuster and delay. Then post 1970s, where you really see a return to power of the capitalist class, well, of course, never really were out of power, but began to kind of go more on the offense instead of playing almost more of a defensive role, I guess you could argue, between really from the 1930s up until the 1970s. But this period of time sees deregulation of business, tax cuts for the wealthy, expansion of household debt, and of course, things we've talked about like the student debt explosion. The Constitution's bias toward property rights and against redistributive demands privileged these outcomes. So again, these things weren't decided in a neutral, balanced way, but the Constitution contains built-in structures that make it easier for these outcomes to occur. And in fact, did not require any significant popular protest from outside, right? These things were all carried out through normal constitutional means. The fragmentation of power made it easy to block reforms, but also difficult to reverse the financialization of the economy as well. So the Constitution as a product of class struggle. Again, the Constitution is not purely an elite imposition. It reflects ongoing struggle. There are some elite concessions there, though they're relatively few. And again, you have to even then assume that the Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment, is actually guaranteed, which in reality is much more uncertainty over that. There were some democratic elements, a written constitution, fixed terms of office, no religious tests, which emerged from the radical traditions of the preceding centuries as well. But the overall bias toward protecting property, fragmenting popular power, and privileging creditors over debtors remains intact today. So if we want to bring together this idea of structure and agency and understand both how that influenced the founding of the Constitution and how the Constitution itself essentially sets the foundation of the structure, which continues to exist today. The Constitution establishes a strategic terrain that systematically privileges strategies of wealth, defense, and elite coordination, while containing strategies of popular redistribution and democratic majoritarianism. Policy outcomes over 230 plus years have repeatedly confirmed this bias, not because of conspiracy, but because of the structure of the state as a social relation, which selectively favors certain actors and interests. Many progressive changes, the New Deal, civil rights, occurred only when mass mobilization overwhelmed the constitutional barriers, and even then they were often contained or rolled back later. I mean, I don't see how you could really disagree with this. But this is one, approach that you can take. I guess you have to, the only other alternative or, main alternative to this is to assume the state, again, somehow a neutral institution, which is only influenced by the, various inputs from groups outside of the government coming into it, and the intensity or the strength of those inputs then determine the outputs. But this shows you that the structures are basically permanently tilted to favor the interests of the wealthy elite over the majority of the population as a whole. Now, again, the idea that the structure exists and it just operates on its own is true to an extent, but you also have to consider where the origins of the structure come from and what kind of intentions were sort of put in shaping the structure as this way. I would not argue that the structure just somehow exists, regardless or somehow independent of any real purpose or intention behind it. It's a structure that's been shaped and evolved over many years, of course, but from its very starting point, there have always been some intentional elements, but that have shaped the structure. Even then, become sort of a self perpetuating thing after that, perhaps. But of course, there are still intentions behind policy as well. And of course, that's what this approach is meant to document, of course, or analyze. I would just argue that the one thing is that you have to consider where the origins of the structure. You can't just necessarily take it as a given, although in the nuances of policy debates that becomes almost a necessity, because you can't always just go back and always consider the origins of the Constitution and the political structure. You just have to isolate how the structure shapes the policy outcomes. So again, outcomes are the results of strategic struggles within a given structural terrain. The Constitution itself was the product of such a struggle. You had various actors shaping the Constitution, the structural context itself in which the Constitution was designed, with the Articles of Confederation, with widespread uprisings, creating a crisis to allow for something like this to take place. The Constitution, of course, was a new set of rules that fundamentally restructured the strategic terrain and continues to influence it afterwards. Thus, the Constitution is a policy outcome of the 1787 to 1789 struggle. It is a constitutional settlement that reflected the balance of class forces, which was not balanced at all, of course, but highly in favor of the elite at that historical moment. But the Constitution is also a strategic terrain for subsequent policy as well. The Constitution is both a policy outcome, the late 18th century class struggle, and the strategic terrain for all subsequent U.S. public policy, student loans, healthcare, taxes, etc. Okay, so that pretty much wraps this up here. So I'm going to conclude. So take care, everyone.